Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Storage DRS. In this lesson, I'll start off by explaining what Storage DRS is. I'll cover the new data store clusters that you'll find in vSphere 5. I'll talk about SDRS initial placement and load balancing, and how you can do data store maintenance now using SDRS. From there, I'll cover the SDRS affinity rules and then walk you through the process of configuring and using Storage DRS. So with that, let's get started. Today, without Storage DRS, when you create a new virtual machine, you have to manually try to find a data store with available space and low latency. From there, once you create it and put it on that data store, you're essentially just hoping for the best storage results for that virtual machine that you can get based on the analysis that you did, perhaps with the SAN admin at that time. And then periodically, you're going to do your best to check and see if the virtual machines are receiving low latency, and you're going to try to do your best to monitor the data stores for low space. And all this best effort is great, but it's really manual virtual machine to storage management. And it's really inefficient. And that inefficiency is costing all parties time and money. It's costing time and money for you, the VMware admin, for the SAN admin, and for the company as a whole, because that manual intervention leaves a lot of room for potential application outages and slowdowns. For example, if a Tier 1 application is on a data store that's experiencing low latency, that application is going to have slowdowns because of the storage I/O problems. You're also going to run into problems if that data store runs out of space. That Tier 1 application could just freeze or hang because the data store is out of space. It can't write to the disk anymore. And you're going to have a lot of unhappy users. So maybe you're using DRS for CPU and RAM, but it really, honestly, today does nothing for storage. That is until SDRS was introduced with vSphere 5. With the new Storage DRS or SDRS, virtual machines and their VMDKs are automatically placed on a data store with the lowest latency and the most space available. And then those virtual machines are automatically balanced by being storage vMotioned to a better data store if they aren't receiving the latency that they need, or if that data store is running out of storage. So that virtual machine can be automatically balanced or moved to a better data store without any downtime to the end users. So this is really cool. No product ever before has been able to do this for us. And so I'm super excited about Storage DRS. This is going to save VMware admins, SAN admins, and the company all time and money. So Storage DRS saves OpEx or operational expenses for the company, and hopefully that can help you to justify perhaps an upgrade to vSphere 5 or additional costs related to vSphere 5 Enterprise Plus. Like Storage DRS, data store clusters are a brand new concept in vSphere 5, and you can use data store clusters with or without SDRS. If you're not using SDRS, you can use data store clusters really just as a grouping of data stores. So it could be an improved management point, kind of like a folder with your data stores inside. With SDRS, a data store cluster is the unit that's used to load balance virtual machine storage across. Just like a DRS cluster is used to balance virtual machines between ESXi servers, a data store cluster is used to balance virtual machine storage across data stores. So think of an SDRS-enabled data store cluster just like you think of a DRS-enabled cluster. Now let's go over to the vSphere client and I'll show you where you'll find data store clusters. So here in the vSphere client, underneath the inventory section here, you've got search, hosts and clusters, virtual machines and templates, and networking. But now you have data stores and data store clusters. So if I click on that, in here you've got your virtual data centers and your data stores under each. If I right-click on a virtual data center, notice this new option that says New Data Store Cluster. I'll click on New Data Store Cluster. This is where you enter the name of your data store cluster and then where you turn on or turn off Storage DRS on that data store cluster. Now, I'm not going to add a new data store cluster at this time because we'll be doing that here in just a second, but I wanted you to see that this is where you create data store clusters. Once you create the data store cluster, then you add your data stores to it. So with that, let's go back to our slides and learn a little bit more about Storage DRS before we come back here and create a Storage DRS enabled data store cluster. One of the ways that Storage DRS helps you is on initial placement of virtual machines. So initial placement means at creation time when the virtual machine is created, when a clone of the virtual machine is created, or when a virtual machine is relocated to a new data store or a different data store cluster. So this initial placement happens to ensure that the virtual machine is placed on the correct data store. The correct data store being the one with the most space available and also the least latency. Now, SDRS virtual machine disk affinity and anti-affinity rules are also available to ensure that, let's say, one particular virtual machine's disk aren't all on the same data store or data store cluster. There's different things you can do, and I'll be covering those here in just a second. Another one of the things that Storage DRS does is load balancing. So SDRS is triggered based on high latency of a data store and low space on a data store. So these things have to happen for the Storage DRS algorithm to take place to determine if a virtual machine needs to be moved. So the space utilization is continuously collected by vCenter, of course. That's already been happening. But now you have the space utilization metric being used with SDRS. So the default threshold to trigger the SDRS algorithm is 80% utilization. So when the utilization of a data store gets above 80%, then that can trigger the SDRS algorithm. Another metric is I/O latency. So if the I/O latency gets above the default threshold of 15 milliseconds, then the SDRS algorithm can be triggered. Now, that's not instantaneous latency because I/O latency, when it comes to SDRS, is evaluated every 8 hours based on the last 24-hour trend. So SDRS isn't going to be making these snap decisions and just moving virtual machine disk around from one data store to another simply because all of a sudden there's a quick increase in I/O latency. It's going to evaluate a much longer term trend. And SDRS also even does a cost-benefit analysis. It determines, hey, what's going to be the potential impact on this virtual machine's disk from moving it? What kind of latency is that going to cause while the move happens to the end users? Could that even make moving the virtual machine's disk files from one data store to another not even worth doing it? So it's going to take all that into account. And by the way, SDRS even works with storage I/O control to take into account which virtual machines have higher priority of I/O shares. So that's what SDRS does. It does the initial placement as well as the load balancing. SDRS can even help you when it comes to data store maintenance. So say that there's a data store that you need to shut down for maintenance. Maybe that SAN LUN has been degraded and you want to swap out one of the disks in the LUN. And during that time, you'd like to just evacuate all the virtual machines off of that data store. So you can actually place a disk volume of a data store cluster, or actually a particular data store that's on a volume, into a maintenance mode, just like you do with an ESXi host. When you place it into maintenance mode, the virtual machines can be evacuated using vMotion. Well, you can do the same thing here with data store maintenance by placing a data store into maintenance mode. SDRS can automatically evacuate those virtual machine disk files to other data stores that are available that have adequate space and also are providing a good I/O throughput. Templates, ISOs, and unregistered virtual machines will remain on that data store when you perform data store maintenance, so you might want to keep that in mind. I mentioned earlier that SDRS has affinity and anti-affinity rules, and I want to thank VMware.com for this graphic here that very nicely explains the VMDK affinity and anti-affinity rules, as well as the virtual machine anti-affinity rules. So there's VMDK affinity rules that say you want to keep a virtual machine disk files together on the same data store. This is on by default, and it's there to maximize virtual machine availability when all disks are needed in order to run. You don't want to have one data store go out and one of the virtual machine's disk was over on that data store, and then the virtual machine can't function at all. Then if you wanted to, you can use virtual machine disk file anti-affinity rules. So let's say for performance, separating, let's say, a database and its log files, you can use virtual machine disk file anti-affinity rules to keep those on different data stores in a data store cluster. And then finally, there's virtual machine anti-affinity rules that say that you want to keep virtual machines on different data stores. You can do that. So you could say, I want my primary Exchange server to be on this data store. I want my secondary Exchange server to be on a different data store. And that way, if one data store goes down, then both of the Exchange servers, so let's say, aren't going to go down. So this is going to maximize the availability for a set of redundant virtual machines. All right, so those are SDRS affinity and anti-affinity rules. And I have some final SDRS notes here before we go off and implement SDRS. First off, I need to point out that it's going to take at least 16 hours, according to VMware.com, of I/O statistics being gathered before SDRS will make its first recommendation based on latency. So don't expect it to make recommendations immediately. Also, you can create a scheduled task to modify SDRS settings. Perhaps during a backup period, you might want to disable SDRS to prevent unnecessary migrations. SDRS is available when you have a vSphere Enterprise Plus license only, so make sure you take that into account. And then Duncan Epping over at yellowbricks.com, a VCDX and a VMware employee, has got some great tips related to using SDRS with your existing SAN features. So what about, auto tiering, replication, deduplication, and then provisioning? Should you use SDRS with those types of SAN features? He's got an article on his blog called Storage DRS Interoperability that you might want to check out if you have those types of questions. So without further delay, let's go over to our vSphere client, and I'll walk you through the steps of implementing vSphere 5's new Storage DRS. To get started implementing Storage DRS, we'll go into Data Stores and Data Store Clusters. And then what we'll do is we'll right-click on a virtual data center and go down to New Data Store Cluster. We'll need to give this data store cluster a name. I'm just going to call it Wired Brain Coffee Data Store Cluster number 1. And we'll take the default here to turn on Storage DRS. I'll click Next. And then now we'll go through a series of questions here related to SDRS automation, rules, hosts and clusters, and the data stores that are involved. So first off, do we want SDRS to be in manual mode and just make migration recommendations for us? Or do we want it to be fully automated and automatically migrate virtual machine storage from one data store to another? And this is the same type of question you get when you implement DRS, where you have manual mode, partially automated, and fully automated. So in our case, let's be aggressive here. Let's say we want to implement fully automated Storage DRS. I'll say Next. Now we're asking a couple questions here. First about I/O metrics. Do we want to include I/O metrics to be used in the evaluation or in the equation for the SDRS recommendations or automatic migrations? That's on by default. I do recommend you enable the use of I/O metrics. Also note here it says that all ESXi servers that are part of the data store cluster need to be running vSphere 5 or later to be able to supply these I/O metrics. And then down here we have Storage DRS threshold. So very similar to the DRS fully automated conservative versus aggressive threshold. Here we've got a couple thresholds that we need to consider. By default, the space utilization threshold is 80%. So if a data store is 80% utilized, then SDRS will evaluate whether or not that virtual machine needs to be moved to another data store. And then there's the I/O latency threshold here, which runs between 5 and 50 milliseconds, the default being 15 milliseconds. So if a data store is experiencing I/O latency of 15 milliseconds or greater, it will consider migrating that virtual machine to another data store. There's also some advanced options here we could choose from. And these have to do first off with how aggressive do you want it to be in making recommendations. So the default is 5%. This goes into the algorithm, basically the math that it does to determine when a recommendation or a migration will be triggered. And then we have here, how often do you want I/O load to be evaluated? We have by default 8 hours, but that can be modified to any number of minutes, hours, or days. And then finally we have the I/O imbalance threshold. And again, this is something that goes into the SDRS equation. So at this point, let's just take these defaults here, and I'll click Next to move on. Now we have to select what hosts and clusters we want to be part of the new data store cluster. Now I don't have any standalone hosts. They're all part of this HADRS cluster. So I'm just going to check that checkbox there. So all the ESXi servers in that HADRS cluster will be part of this new data store cluster. I'll click Next. Now we're being asked which data stores we want to add to the data store cluster. And by default up here, it's only going to show data stores that are connected to all hosts. And of course, that's really what we want. We don't want data stores that are just connected to some hosts or all data stores. Most likely, you're going to want data stores that are only connected to all the hosts. So in our case, let's just check both of these. I've got 2 data stores They just happen to be on the same SAN in this case, but that doesn't mean that you don't need SDRS. I mean, one SAN LUN could be experiencing latency whereas the other one isn't. One could run out of space where the other one isn't. So even if you just have one SAN, Storage DRS can really help you out. I'll click Next here, and now we're ready to create our brand new Storage DRS data store cluster. I'll click Finish. It's moving the data stores into the data store cluster. You can see up here, it moved the data stores in there. I configured Storage DRS, and the process is complete. So now I can click on my new data store cluster. Let's go to the Summary tab here. And now here in the Summary tab, we can see the total number of data stores in the cluster, the total amount of capacity, the total amount of used space, free space, and then the data store that has the largest free space, how much free space is there. We can see that we have 8 virtual machines in here with a total of 10 VMDKs and 2 snapshots. Over on the right-hand side, you can see that I/O metrics are enabled. Storage DRS is also enabled. It's set to fully automated. And then we can see our space utilization and I/O latency thresholds. If we go to the Virtual Machines tab, we can see all the virtual machines that are part of the data store cluster here. And then we can see all the hosts that are part of the cluster. In our case, it's one cluster and then 2 hosts below. We can see all the data stores that are part of the cluster. And then under Storage DRS, this should look very familiar to you because it's identical to the regular or traditional DRS tab that you would see over in the hosts and clusters inventory. So here you've got recommendations, you've got faults, and then you've got the history view. You can also click here to run the Storage DRS algorithm and see what happens. Now, I don't have anything immediate in here to show you, and that's because, like I said back in the slides, SDRS takes up to 16 hours to give you some recommendations or to take action and migrate virtual machines. That's because it wants to use the long-term trending history of the I/O latency and the storage utilization. Of course, you can tweak the time frame. In fact, if we go in here to the data store cluster properties, and if we go to the runtime rules, and down here to the advanced options, this is where you can set it to evaluate the load more or less frequency. Something else I want to show you in here that wasn't on the wizard when we created SDRS is the SDRS scheduling. So like I mentioned earlier, you can actually create a scheduled task to, let's say, disable SDRS during a certain time period, like when your backups happen. So I could click Add here, and let's just take the default and say between 1:30 and 5:30 a.m. Monday through Friday, I want to run this task. I'll say Next, and let's say I want to stop SDRS during backups. And what I'm going to do at that time is to drop the automation level to manual, and then to uncheck Enable I/O metrics for SDRS recommendations. So it shouldn't even be looking at I/O at all. I'll say Next here, and then I'll say Start SDRS. And then I could say I want to restore the settings to the original configuration, or I could set it just to fully automated and just leave all this as default. It gives me a quick summary here. I'll say Finish, and then I created a scheduled task that runs at 1:30 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. to stop SDRS and restart SDRS. For example, when backups occur. I think that's a great use for the SDRS scheduled task. Something else you can do is underneath Rules here, you can go in and you can add rules. So these are the affinity and anti-affinity rules I was talking about. So say that I wanted to keep VMs apart. I could create a VM anti-affinity rule here. I could add virtual machines, and I could say, hey, I want these 2 virtual machines to be kept apart, vCenter and Windows 2008 Active Directory. I'll say OK there. Of course, in the real world, these would probably be 2, let's say a database server that's like primary and secondary, or whatever the case might be. I'll say OK, and then we created a anti-affinity rule to keep 2 virtual machines apart from one another. We could also go here to virtual machine settings, and then just like in DRS, actually I can go per virtual machine here, and I can set each virtual machine that's part of this cluster to have a separate setting than what the default is, or a different setting than what the default is. So they could be fully automated, they could be manual or disabled. And then I can uncheck the checkbox here to keep virtual machines disk files together if I wanted to do that per virtual machine. So these are really just per virtual machine settings that you can configure with SDRS. So there's a lot you can do with this. We talked about the automation, the runtime rules, scheduling, the virtual machine disk and virtual machine affinity and anti-affinity rules, and then finally the per virtual machine settings. You saw how to create a new SDRS data store cluster. Basically, you go into the data store and data store cluster inventory. Then you use the create a new data store cluster wizard, which allows you to enable that data store cluster for Storage DRS. So with that accomplished, let's go back to our slides. And that brings us to the summary for this lesson. I started off by explaining the new vSphere 5 feature, Storage DRS, and how it's going to help you to automate the placement of new virtual machine disk files and also to keep virtual machine disk files load balanced across data stores in order to ensure that those virtual machine disk files get the performance that they need, get the throughput that they need, and also that they aren't on data stores that are running out of disk space. SDRS has a very nice data store maintenance feature that allows you to evacuate virtual machine disk files from data stores if you put those into maintenance mode. There's some real nice SDRS affinity and anti-affinity rules. And then I walked you through the whole process of configuring the new Storage DRS from start to finish. Thanks for watching this lesson covering vSphere 5's Storage DRS.